100. Forgotten Things from 1980s New York. A city dancing between nostalgia and revolution. The 1960s didn't arrive in New York with a whisper. They came with a horn blast, echoing off skyscrapers, rumbling through subway tunnels, and shouting from transistor radios propped in second-story windows. At first, not much looked different. The shoeshine men still worked corners near Grand Central. Newsboys still barked headlines in front of Woolworths. But something in the air had shifted, a faster rhythm, a sharper edge, a pulse that said change was no longer coming. It was here. You could hear it on the radio. Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Sam Cooke. Songs that didn't just play, they asked. Why, when? What next? The music didn't just fill rooms anymore. It filled people, and people poured out into the streets. At Washington Square Park, the folk singers gathered like clockwork. Long-haired kids in beat-up coats strummed guitars on benches worn smooth. They weren't playing for fame. They were playing to be heard, really heard. Pigeons fluttered overhead. Someone passed around pretzels. You could sit there for hours and feel like something important might happen before sunset. Downtown, the village had begun to glow differently. Coffee shops doubled as poetry clubs. Behind bead curtains and fogged-up windows, young men recited Kerouac by candlelight, while someone in the back rolled a cigarette with slow, steady hands. You didn't clap, you snapped your fingers. That meant you got it. On the Upper West Side, families watched the moon landing on black and white TVs balanced on doilies. The reception was fuzzy, the sound cutting in and out, but nobody moved. Even the fussiest child sat still as a shadow. When Armstrong took that step, the whole building held its breath, and then cheered, like he'd landed right on Riverside Drive. The first Beatles song on AM radio caused a minor riot at a Bronx corner store. Teens pressed their faces to the display window, mouthing the words as if they'd always known them. Inside, the clerk just turned up the volume and smiled, knowing nothing would ever be quite the same. Sidewalks buzzed differently. Taxi horns mixed with protest chants. Suits and miniskirts walked the same blocks, pretending not to see each other. Kids wore mood rings and carried notebooks full of dreams. Old men on stoops just shook their heads and muttered, "It's not like the 50s?" And they were right. In Harlem, the record shops were temples. Rows of vinyl in paper sleeves, Sam and Dave, Aretha Franklin, Otis Redding stacked like sacred texts. You walked in and were hit with the scent of plastic linoleum wax and ambition. The clerk behind the counter knew more than Billboard ever could. Side B, he'd say, that's the one. The Apollo Theater glowed like a crown on 125th Street. Friday nights, kids in borrowed blazers stood in line, holding their breath, hoping to see someone who'd one day be a legend. You didn't need tickets, just a friend who knew someone or the guts to sneak in during intermission. When the curtain rose, the world stopped. The steam radiators still hissed in old buildings, even as the world outside turned electric. On cold mornings, the pipes groaned like sleeping giants. You'd sit by the window in your wool socks, watching the city rise coffee carts. Cab drivers, the paper boy with ink-stained gloves, all wrapped in fog and purpose. Studio 54 hadn't hit its disco peak yet, but downtown had already begun to shimmer. You could feel it. Small clubs and basements pulsed with velvet voices and long, strange saxophone solos. Somewhere behind red curtains, people danced like they had secrets. It wasn't glamorous yet. It was raw, underground beautiful. In Brooklyn, front stoops became fashion runways. Kids in bell bottoms and paisley shirts twirled yo-yos and argued about who was cooler, Smokey Robinson or the Supremes. Hair was bigger, colors were louder, and style was no longer inherited. It was invented daily with glue glitter and guts. Elevators and high-rises got mirrors. Suddenly, your reflection became part of the ride. You straightened your tie, fluffed your hair, practiced your smile. You never knew who'd step in on the next floor. It could be your crush, your boss, or just a stranger who'd change your day with a single glance. The subways were a gallery. Spray-painted tags, stenciled slogans, and Sharpie confessions scrawled on steel. Make love not war. Jesus saves. Linda forever. The cars rumbled through tunnels like time machines. Sometimes the lights flickered off. No one screamed. You just waited, then moved on. The public library smelled the same old pages, floor polish and quiet. But the books changed. Paperbacks with wild covers. Titles that hinted at rebellion, love, danger. You didn't check them out. You read them there, one chapter at a time, hidden between study. Carol's heartbeat. Quick eyes wide. In Queens, every block had a garage band. You could hear the drum beat from 3 houses down, muffled off tempo, full of promise. Boys with sideburns and secondhand guitars sang into hairbrushes and believed it was possible. Sometimes they got good, sometimes they didn't. But either way, the dream was loud. In Flushing Meadows, the echo of the 1964 World's Fair still hung in the air. The Unisphere stood like a silver promise against the sky. Families picnicked near fountains that once danced to music. Kids ran through overgrown paths pretending they were astronauts. No one talked much about the future. It had already come and gone. Outside the subway stations, anti-war posters bloomed like graffiti. Bring them home. No more napalm. Draft coffins, not boys. Wheat pasted over ads for cigarettes and Broadway shows they peeled in the rain. But the words lingered. You read them at 13 and understood more than you wanted to. The first color TV on your block was a miracle. You didn't own it, but you visited. The family upstairs had one zenith with wood paneling and a dial like a ship's wheel. When Bonanza came on, the living room filled with neighbors balancing paper plates on their laps, mouths open at the lime green grass and too blue sky. It didn't look real, but it was mesmerizing. The sound of typewriters still filled offices downtown. The keys clacked like rain on metal roofs. Secretaries answered phones with one hand and typed with the other. Carbon paper stained fingers. Ashtrays overflowed. And somewhere someone yelled, "Where's that file?" like it was the most important question in the world. At Union Square, old chess players moved their pieces with surgical precision. Clock ticking. Pigeons waiting. Students watched from benches, some taking notes, not of the game, but of the way time seemed to bend around those squares. One wrong move, and the whole board tilted. Just like life. Corner stores sold bubble gum with protest slogans. Ban the bomb. Flower power. Make peace, not grades. You bought it for the flavor, sure. But sometimes you kept the wrapper in your wallet, like maybe, just maybe, you were part of something bigger than Bazooka Joe. The East River wasn't beautiful, but it was honest. Ferries crossed slow, Oil slicks shimmered near the docks. Kids threw pebbles and dared each other to touch the water. You could smell iron salt and something old, something the city hadn't washed away yet, and maybe never would. On hot nights, apartment doors stayed open. Box fans blew curtain lace into the hallway. Neighbors called out across floors, "You watchin' Ed Sullivan. You hear what happened at Columbia." The building felt like one living organism, breathing, sweating, listening. Everyone knew who needed ice, who had extra bread, who was pregnant, who was drafted. Elevated trains still screeched across the Bronx, but they carried a different kind of silence now. The kind that came after someone said goodbye at the platform. The kind that came from reading the telegram twice, hoping it might change. Soldiers left from Grand Central. Some returned, some didn't. The city made room for the grief without ever slowing down. And yet, on Saturday mornings, kids still watch cartoons in their pajamas. Cereal boxes lined up like soldiers. The sun angled in through soot-scratched windows. And for 20 precious minutes, no one talked about war race rent or rights. Just Roadrunner Bugs Bunny and the sound of spoons against ceramic. The laundromats hummed like tired lungs. Rows of washing machines lined up like soldiers round glass eyes, spinning detergent and stories. Kids sat on plastic chairs swinging their legs. Grandmothers read romance novels. The air smelled of bleach, warm cotton, and steam, as if the whole block was trying to scrub something from the past. Downtown cafes served more than caffeine. They served conversation. One table argued about the Vietnam draft. Another whispered about Baldwin's latest speech. A pair of Columbia students passed a single copy of the Communist Manifesto across crumbs and black coffee. Nearby, a painter with oil on her hands hummed Coltrane through cracked lips. Letters still mattered. Long looping script on yellow paper. My dearest, yours in thought. Love always, M. You licked the stamp, sealed the truth, and dropped it in a box painted with chipped blue hope. Sometimes it took weeks to reach them, but somehow it always arrived right on time. Coney Island still drew crowds in the summer, but the edges frayed. The cyclone creaked louder. The paint peeled from the wonder wheel. Yet kids still screamed, and lovers still shared cotton candy near the surf. You knew it was fading, but you loved it anyway, because some magic doesn't need polishing to shine. Newsstands sold more than headlines. They sold dreams. Film magazines with glossy covers. Paperback novels stacked in twine. Tabloids with Elvis the Kennedy's The War. You'd flip through a copy of Life and wonder if your city would ever make it into those pages, and if it did, would it look like this street preacher stood on milk crates with Bibles in hand, shouting into traffic like prophets with too much to say. Some cursed, some cried, some just begged people to listen. You didn't always stop, but you remembered their faces and how they never blinked even when no one listened. Fire escapes became balconies, plants in old soup cans, towels drying in the wind, radios tuned to baseball games or Motown ballads. Kids climbed through the window to watch the city below, sirens wailing couples, arguing dogs, barking horns honking. It wasn't quiet, but it felt like home. The hallways of city high schools buzzed with a different urgency. The bulletin boards now held notices for anti-war meetings. The janitor nodded to students with afro picks in their back pockets. The principal walked slower, and somewhere in a corner stairwell, A girl wrote poetry on her arm in blue pen. Subway graffiti moved from scrawl to message. Resist. Black is beautiful. Free love. Some were just names. Some were rage. Some were hope in capital letters. The city tried to scrub them off, but they always came back. Because walls, like people, remember where the pain was. And still, the Mr. Softy truck rolled in summer. Its jingle bounced down side streets, calling barefoot kids from stoops and sprinklers. You didn't have enough for the dipped cone, but the vanilla was sweet, the napkin thin, and for 5 minutes it was enough to silence the world. On New Year's Eve, rooftops became front row seats to the sky. Families carried folding chairs and thermoses of instant cocoa upstairs, bundled in coats too thin for the wind. From the Bronx to Brooklyn, faces turned upward as fireworks bloomed behind water towers. No one had a perfect view, but no one cared. The city belonged to anyone looking up. The corner drugstore still sold everything: toothpaste, cough syrup, Valentine cards, toy rings in plastic eggs. You walked in, holding your grandfather's hand, and watched him talk to the pharmacist like an old friend. The shelves were tall. The soda fountain hissed behind the counter. And everything smelled like wintergreen and dust. The last train from Manhattan to Queens carried stories, some whispered, some passed, between tired shoulders, lovers who missed curfew, musicians with empty guitar cases, a nurse with tired feet, and a novel she never quite finished. The fluorescent lights flickered. The city didn't sleep, but this train, this one yawned. At dusk, the East Village glowed amber. Street lamps flickered on, casting long shadows on cracked sidewalks and chalk drawings. Shop windows filled with incense, handmade jewelry, and protest flyers curled at the corners. You walked home with a paper bag full of lentils, a borrowed book, and a quiet thought you couldn't quite name. Movie nights in the park were never about the film. The reel clicked. The projector sputtered. Mosquitoes swirled under the glow. Couples huddled under picnic blankets. Kids danced in front of the screen until someone yelled, "Sit down." You don't remember the plot. You remember the laughter, the hush, the shared popcorn. The mailman still knew your name. He wore a navy jacket in summer and whistled through crooked teeth. He handed your mother postcards from cousins in California and bills with hand-scrawled addresses. Once, he gave you a package and said, "Handle this one with care." You did and always have since. In Chinatown, lanterns floated like fireflies across the narrow streets. You'd walk with your father, past ducks hanging in windows, a scent of star anise, and soy thick in the air. You stopped for sesame balls wrapped in wax paper and watched a woman write your name in calligraphy you couldn't read, but somehow understood. Sometimes you'd pass a window and see a television glowing blue behind curtains. A soap opera, a news bulletin, the Mets. You'd slow down, not to spy, but to feel part of the world behind the glass. A slice of someone else's life, quiet and flickering, like a candle left on just in case. On rainy Sundays, sidewalks glistened like vinyl records. Taxi lights shimmered in puddles. Steam rose from manholes in soft spirals. You pulled your coat tighter, stepped over garbage lids and gutters, and thought this city may be messy, but it moves. And if you move with it, you just might survive. At the edges of the city, where row houses leaned like old men and chain link fences guarded tiny yards, children still played. Stickball, with broom handles, freeze tag, kick the can. The games weren't about winning. They were about staying out until the streetlights blinked, and maybe 5 minutes after. Record shops were temples of youth. Rows of sleeves, glossy and vibrant, stood like stained glass windows to the soul. You'd thumb through the Stones, the Ronettes, Marvin Gaye, not just looking, listening with your eyes. The clerk wore sunglasses indoors. The speakers buzzed. And when you found the one you came for, the world felt slightly more in tune. You met eyes with a stranger on the subway just once. Maybe on the 6 train somewhere between Astor Place and 14th. You never spoke, never saw them again. But for those 6 stops, something passed between you. A shared song on someone's headphones, the quiet rhythm of being alone, but not lonely. Old churches echoed in ways you couldn't explain. You sat near the back pews, the wooden bench hard and cold. The choir sang, in layers, deep, high, broken whole. No one asked you why that you were there. They didn't need to. The air was thick with incense and unspoken things. Sometimes just sitting there was enough. Neighborhood bars were sanctuaries for stories. Bartenders with knowing eyes and rags slung over shoulders. Stools that creaked like old jokes. Men in their 40s who danced like they were 20. Women who drank slow and watched the door always. The jukebox played Otis Dusty or Patsy Cline. Nobody asked for silence, but when it came, it wasn't empty. In Little Italy, espresso wasn't trendy. It was tradition. Tiny cups, burnt sugar rims, and thick conversation. You sat outside on folding chairs that wobbled on cobblestone. Your uncle stirred his slowly talking about the Yankees, about Sicily, about how America didn't taste like it used to. Then he took a sip and nodded as if making peace with the difference. Sidewalk chalk wasn't just for hopscotch. Kids wrote poetry, drew cartoons, left love notes in pastel swirls. Rain washed it away, sure, but not before someone saw it. Not before it meant something. Maybe just to the kid who wrote it. Maybe to the girl who read it. Maybe both. In jazz clubs, with no signs out front, you found heaven below street level. Red lights, blue smoke hands snapping in sync. A trumpet solo that made you forget the world had corners. The bartender poured slow. The drummer blinked in time. And when someone cried at the end of a song, no one asked why. Apartment lobbies had glass showcases filled with flyers, piano lessons, missing cats, babysitting jobs, revolution meetings. You read them like postcards from strangers, free concert in the park, lost ring near 2nd Ave, looking for something real. The ink faded fast. The longing never did. In bodegas at midnight, you could buy cereal soda or a broken heart conversation with the night clerk. He barely looked up, but he remembered your name, your cigarettes, your favorite candy bar. You okay? He'd ask. And somehow, that was the kindest thing anyone had said all day. In the Bronx, balconies became miniature worlds. Folded chairs faced the street like theater seats. Laundry hung between railings. A small radio played The Temptations, while someone's grandmother shelled peas into a bowl. Kids shouted below. The breeze carried someone's perfume, someone's argument, and the smell of dinner being made without a recipe. School desks told stories no textbook ever could. L plus M, carved into the wood grain. a line of poetry scribbled on the edge in pencil. I exist in rooms they forgot to name. The final bell rang, but you lingered not for grades, but for the way light slanted through those tall windows in June. That feeling stayed. At the neighborhood barber shop, debates were louder than the Clippers. Knicks or Dodgers, Johnson or Kennedy. Should we be in Vietnam or not at all? The barber never chose sides, he just kept cutting. Hair fell like paper snow, and the conversation swirled in the mirrors, half politics, half prayer. Gas stations were shrines to motion. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A kid wiped windshields while humming the Four Tops. The attendant checked your oil without asking. He knew your car, your name, your father. When he said, "Take care now," you felt like someone meant it. The rooftop still held summer secrets. You sneaked up after dinner, past laundry lines and rusted chairs. You kissed someone, or almost did, and then ran down laughing, heart pounding. The water towers above you stood like quiet witnesses, dark against the twilight sky. In Queens, backyards barely big enough for a folding table hosted entire family reunions. Plastic forks, paper streamers. A radio balanced on a windowsill, playing Sinatra next to someone's uncle singing off-key. The fire escape became the second row. The grill smoked. Someone always danced. Candy stores were more than shelves. They were archives of childhood. Licorice whips, wax bottles, candy cigarettes that made you feel like someone older. The bell above the door rang with a kind of welcome no one says out loud anymore. The man behind the counter knew if you had 2 dimes or just a good story. The old men at the park played dominoes like they were negotiating peace treaties. Slam. Pause. Stare. The table was scratched. The rules unspoken. You could sit on the bench and watch them for hours pretending you weren't waiting for someone to notice you, invite you in. Sometimes they did. Sometimes just watching was enough. The city buses had green vinyl seats that stuck to your legs in summer. The driver wore a cap tilted just so. He nodded when you stepped on, tapped the glass twice when someone ran to catch the door. Sometimes the ride was short. Sometimes it was all the escape you had. At night, the streets didn't sleep. They softened. Neon signs blinked slower. Footsteps echoed longer. You walked home with a paper bag of leftovers and a heart full of questions. A cat darted under a parked car. A saxophone played 3 floors up. And you thought, how strange that this city, so loud, can also hum you to sleep. Public libraries were cathedrals of stillness. Wooden chairs creaked like whispers. Ceiling fans turned with lazy dignity. You wandered the stacks, fingertips grazing spines. Faulkner, Ellison, Salinger. The librarian barely spoke, but always knew. Try this one, she'd say, and it was always exactly what your heart hadn't known it needed. The Jewish delis along 2nd Avenue were holy ground in their own right. The rye bread was thick, the pastrami thicker. A pickle came without asking. The waiter called you Bubble, whether he knew your name or not. He slid your sandwich across the waxed counter with the same care as someone setting down a newborn. The last Polaroid shop on the Lower East Side had a bell that rang like memory. The man behind the counter wore suspenders and cologne that smelled like dust and aftershave. You stood in front of a cracked backdrop, City Skyline, 1956, and tried not to blink. The photo clicked. The paper warmed, and within seconds there you were, imperfect, honest, whole. Sunday mornings came with ritual. A church bell somewhere in Harlem echoed through laundry lines and scaffoldings. Kids in polished shoes fidgeted on stoops. A woman in a wide-brimmed hat walked with purpose. And far below, the soft rumble of the subway reminded you the city kept moving even when your soul paused. On rainy afternoons, diners became sanctuaries. You ordered grilled cheese and tomato soup, not because you were hungry, but because the day needed warmth. The waitress refilled your coffee, like a quiet promise. Outside, taxis splashed past. Inside, you stirred your spoon, slowly listening to the world drip softer. Photo booths still stood in Woolworth's vestibules. Red curtain, silver stool, 4 frames for a quarter. You posed with your best friend, your date, your brother. Made faces, held your breath. Waited. The strip came out warm and slightly crooked. You tore it in half and gave them the better side. Fire hydrants doubled as summer fountains. One wrench, one willing teen, and the whole block came alive. Kids screamed. Cars slowed. Someone's mother yelled from a third-story window. Your sneakers squished for the rest of the day, and you didn't care, because being soaked meant you'd been there. Bus stops had wooden benches and stories carved into them. Names, hearts, jokes, prayers. You'd sit with your lunch in your lap, reading every scratch like scripture. Sometimes the bus came. Sometimes it didn't. But the bench always held you, and what you were too shy to say aloud. Candy-colored laundromats pulsed with fluorescent light and AM radio. You learned to dance folding towels. Teenagers flirted over detergent choices. A toddler crawled beneath the change machine giggling. The dryer spun your jeans and your secrets. You left smelling like lavender and listening to Aretha in your head. And sometimes the magic wasn't big. It was this: a small cafe, a newspaper still warm from the press, a buttered roll wrapped in wax paper. You sat near the window watching the sun climb through scaffolding and thought, I live here. This is my life. And somehow, that was enough. In Prospect Park, fall came with rustling promises, leaves curled like handwritten notes and scattered across walking paths. Couples strolled with silence between them, not because there was nothing to say, but because the city, just for once, was doing the talking. Somewhere a saxophone whispered from a bench. Somewhere a child chased a red leaf like it was treasure. The music store on West 72nd had windows fogged from breath and dreams. Guitars hung like halos from hooks. Drum kits sparkled under fluorescent lights. You didn't need money to enter, just courage to ask, "Can I try that one?" And when you did the first pluck, the first note made you believe you were more than just a kid with calloused fingers. Public payphones stood like little confessionals. You stepped in, closed the glass door, and fed it a dime. The city faded for 30 seconds. I miss you. I'm sorry. I got the job. Sometimes you said nothing at all. Just listened to the hum on the line and the sound of someone still breathing far away. On October evenings, stoops collected leaves like old men collected stories. You sat on cold stone steps, sweater pulled tight, watching the wind rearrange the block. Jack-o'-lanterns began to appear, crooked smiles and candles flickering in the dusk. You didn't need a calendar to know it was almost time for change. Corner diners switched from lemonade to hot cider. You cupped the mug with both hands, warming your fingers and your insides. The waitress wore an orange pin on her collar. Vote November 8th. She topped off your drink without asking. You looked out the window and watched the city put on its coat. The subway grew quieter in fall. Scarves muffled voices. Coats turned everyone into strangers. Fog clung to the windows, and you wrote initials in the glass with your finger, yours and someone else's. The train rattled forward, not knowing what it carried. A love story, a resignation letter, a poem in someone's pocket. In the schoolyard, jump ropes thudded against pavement slick with early frost. A teacher in a wool coat shouted, "Line up," but no one really moved. You wiped your nose on your sleeve and raced for one last round before the bell. Your breath hung in the air like chalk. You felt older. You didn't know why. Grocery stores smelled different in fall cinnamon, apples, potatoes, and burlap sacks. The produce guy wore fingerless gloves and handed you a bruised pear with a grin. "It's still sweet," he said. You bit into it right there. He was right. Some things aren't perfect, just perfectly timed. Apartment windows glowed amber at dinner time. You'd walk by rows of tenements, catching glimpses of lives mid-scene. A father reading a paper, a kid doing homework, a radio tuned low. The air smelled like tomato sauce and old radiator heat. You didn't know these people, but somehow you loved them. And in the middle of all that movement, subway brakes, leaf blowers, footsteps on pavement, there was a moment, maybe just one, when the city paused. A breeze carried the scent of wood smoke. The sky turned that impossible New York orange. And you thought, "I will remember this." And you did. At the end of the decade, the train stations got quieter, not in sound, but in certainty. Penn Station once echoing with hellos, and hopefuls now whispered of departures that didn't promise return. The signs changed. The conductors changed. The faces waiting with bouquets and paper bags slowly thinned. You noticed, even if no one else said it aloud. The corner stores started closing earlier. Some stayed shut. The candy counter was replaced by cigarettes. The man who once knew your favorite soda retired without a party. A new guy came in, didn't look up when you entered, and suddenly it felt like a page had turned, not loudly, but finally. On the streets, peace signs faded. So did chalk slogans and wheat-pasted posters. "Make love not war" was replaced with "for lease." Some voices grew tired. Some grew louder. Others disappeared between headlines and subway stops. You couldn't remember when the hope felt heavier than the cause. But it did. In Central Park, the same bench where your brother once proposed now bore graffiti, not artful, not angry. Just initials scrawled quick. You sat there one afternoon, coat zipped to your chin, and watched two teenagers feed pigeons with indifference. One of them wore headphones. The other lit a cigarette and didn't offer one. The jukebox in the corner diner played fewer oldies. No one noticed. New songs came harder, faster, hungrier. You still chose Sam Cooke when you had the chance, but your quarter felt like a quiet protest. One last spin of "A change is gonna come," even as the world had already changed and didn't wait. Payphones stopped ringing. Not because no one used them, but because no one called just because anymore. You passed one on 10th Avenue receiver, dangling coin slot jammed with gum. You remembered your father's voice through that static once. You didn't pick it up. You just looked at it a second longer. Television no longer belonged to families. It belonged to news. Kennedy's death, Malcolm's death, King's death. One screen, too many eulogies. You watched from the hallway while your mother wept with a dish towel in her hand. The anchors never blinked. The world did. Old radios sat silent on windowsills. The fabric on the speakers peeled back, the knobs stuck. You didn't throw them away. You couldn't. They had once brought you Sunday jazz and Roosevelt's last words. Now they were just waiting, like they might speak again, someday. Snow fell differently in '69, maybe heavier, maybe just quieter. You shoveled your sidewalk and realized no one else was out. No snowball fights. No children laughing. Just the hum of a passing bus and the crunch of your boots. You paused, looked up, and for a second, the city held its breath. You walked past the Woolworths one afternoon and saw a going out of business sign taped to the glass. Inside, a clerk swept the same floor you used to run across in saddle shoes. You stood there longer than you meant to. A child walked past you, tugging at their parent's coat. What was this place, they asked. You didn't answer, because you didn't know how to explain what it was, only what it meant.